Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. One of the most interesting aspects of the High Republic period is that we get to see the Jedi in what is supposedly their golden age. The Republic, the Jedi are both at the height of their power, and you know how a lot of supporters of the Jedi always say, well, they could do a lot of good if the Sith weren't around and if geopolitics are on their side. And so this is exactly that. This is the time when the Jedi get to shine. And so today I want to do a thought exercise where we basically take a look at the economic and political situation of the High Republic and try to guess just how many Jedi are in the Order at the peak of their power. Anyway, we're going to be talking about the High Republic period, which goes from around 500 BBY to 100 BBY. This is a 4-century period of time. It's pretty vast. This period starts roughly 500 years after the 7th Battle of Ruusan and the destruction of the Brotherhood of Darkness, the last known Sith organization to exist in the galaxy at the time, aside from Darth Bane's secretive Rule of Two order. This Jedi Republic victory marks an end to roughly 4,000 years of on and off conflict between the Jedi and the Sith, and that would actually lead to what's known as the Ruusan Reformation, which removed the Jedi from leadership positions from the Republic federal military and also disbanded the federal military. All funding from the federal military would gradually be shifted to local planetary defense forces and sector defense forces. There are also several limits placed on the executive branch of government. By decentralizing power, both from a military and political point of view, the idea was to prevent any kind of authoritarian government from taking hold of the galaxy and at the same time allow local governments to take a more active role in how they spent their money for their own defense. The idea was this would be more efficient than having a massive centralized military. And this does make sense to a certain degree. I mean, areas that bordered wilder and more dangerous parts of space could spend more money on robust planetary defense forces, and safer worlds, especially in the core, could spend a little less. For centuries, the galaxy would rebuild until, wars were something you would only read about, basically in the history books. As a result, the needs of the populations in the Republic changed, and so did the policies of their elected officials, which created a very different environment that the galaxy probably never experienced before in its history. We're going to go a little bit into geopolitics for some references here, because this period of the High Republic actually reminds me a lot of Europe post-Cold War up until pretty much recently. This was a period of time of record economic growth and peace and stability. We saw many European countries, especially in Western Europe, spend relatively low amounts of their GDP on military spending. What money they did spend was focused on retaining a professional officer corps and maintaining the local military-industrial complex at their lowest feasible operating rates. These are two things you want to preserve. That knowledge and infrastructure are not things you want to lose in case you want to quickly ramp up the size of your military if there is a crisis. Instead, European politicians focused on growing their local economies and social services, a much more popular use of cash, according to the public, and in the long run, a much smarter move as well. Now, I do have to mention a lot of Americans complain about U.S. taxpayer money going into NATO and basically providing a security umbrella over much of Europe. While this is true, there's also the flip side. The United States also greatly benefits from military spending because of our massive industrial military complex, which is hundreds of billion dollars in size and larger than some smaller European countries. We also have a pretty massive economy, which was roughly the size of the entire EU and now considerably larger. One could argue, at least in the past, we could handle the burden. For many of the smaller European nations, a large peacetime military could have a very negative effect on inflation and just economic growth, especially because most European countries tend to have more entitlement and social programs built into their spending, along with an aging population. But in the long run, 2 to 3 decades of lower military spending has helped increase economic growth for most of the EU and the UK, which means that their economies are in a much better position to support ramping up of military spending should a crisis unfold. Now, essentially, the Galactic Republic experienced a similar effect to Western Europe, but many times longer. Roughly 1,000 years of limited military spending led to compounding economic growth, something that the galaxy, again, probably never witnessed before. I mean, prior to the Ruusan Reformation, every few hundred years, a band of marauding Mandalorians, or Sith, or some Sith proxy, or some other barbaric Xeno race came knocking on the doors of civilization and set back the galactic economy decades, sometimes even centuries. On a few occasions, they even made it to the core of the galaxy, to Coruscant. On a few occasions, they almost wiped out the entire Jedi Order. And on one occasion, they even sacked the Jedi Temple. But 1,000 years of unprecedented peace meant that the High Republic central government had many years in the black when it came to their budget. Now, if we take a look at the reign of Lina So, the Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Republic in 234 BBY, we can see just how rich the High Republic was. Her main focus during her term was to create a series of outreach programs dedicated to basically including the Outer Rim in the Republic and hopefully signing up many of these Outer Rim planets to join the Republic. This is roughly about a century before the events in the Acolyte, for those of you who are wondering. Unlike the Free Trade Zone, which was established more than a century later, her initiatives came with actual financial and security backing, thanks to the Jedi. The Jedi Order would establish several outposts in the Outer Rim, like the Jedi Temple on Olega, for instance, and those outposts would all be linked to the Starlight Beacon space station, one of Chancellor So's so-called Great Works. This was a very expensive and massive structure that served not only as a hyperspace beacon for wary travelers in the Outer Rim, it also boosted the communication networks in the region, which were spotty at best, and served as a hub for the Jedi and the Republic Defense Coalition. The RDC is a classic High Republic style program that really highlights the unity and hope in the galaxy during this time period. This was a Republic-led organization not all that different from NATO or the Kosovo Force, in which several local planetary defense forces from planets like Alderaan and Chandrila gave the central government control during emergencies. This technically was not a standing federal military because that would be against the law. Also, the RDC was only active during emergencies and conflicts, and individual units would be disbanded after the crisis resolved, which again really limits how much money the federal military has to spend. And so this organization really helped the Republic at minimal costs defend against larger threats that were spread across multiple sectors that, individual planetary defense forces couldn't really handle by themselves. So a more stable economy with continuous growth, a security arrangement that seems adequate, means a far more peaceful galaxy. And for a short period of time, it actually started working. You started seeing more growth and development in the Outer Rim. As a matter of fact, later on in the Clone Wars period, we'll see that there are some pretty populated planets in the Outer Rim. They're not many, but there are a few, and this most likely is due to the High Republic period and that spending that was pushed towards the Outer Rim. Now, this all in turn should make the Jedi's job much easier and safer. Jedi during this period mainly served as peacekeepers, diplomats, but also in special cases were prepared for direct action against the enemies of the Republic. But for the most part, the Jedi were still deployed alongside judicial forces, just like what we see in the prequels, and they kind of served as diplomats and also space cops in a way. Although there were still plenty of dangers in the wider galaxy, like the conflict with the Path of the Open Hand and the Nile Marauders, which caused the Great Hyperspace Disaster and a terrifying Drengir outbreak, the Jedi casualties in the field still should have been much lower than during the Clone Wars, when they actively served on battlefields. If we take a look at this scene 100 years before the prequels even started, where Jedi Knight Yord Fandar boards a Trade Federation ship in what seems like a routine traffic stop, his demeanor, his arrogance, and comfort with the situation are on full display, meaning that individuals like Yord are perhaps used to being in control of situations and not really used to facing any challenges or hostility. If we take a look at the Jedi outpost on Olega, we see that the local Jedi watchmen here are quite out of shape and have very limited security guarding the temple, another sign of just a lack of hostility. Now, some of you might say, oh, the Jedi were extremely weak and stupid during this time period. I would just say that the galaxy was probably a better place to live in. I mean, think about airports before 9/11. I mean, you could bring all sorts of crazy stuff onto airplanes, and it was relatively okay. More visible security everywhere doesn't always mean good things. Actually, it usually means the opposite. On even less inhabited worlds like Ueda or Kofar, we see Jedi being deployed without any backup, another sign that generally the Jedi didn't face major threats in their postings no matter where they were in the galaxy. As such, the mysterious murders of the Brendok 4 in 132 BBY was so alarming that the Grand Master of the Jedi Council, Vernestra Rwoh, was willing to go to great lengths to cover up the incident. She basically feared that the Senate and political opposition to the Jedi would be able to use the situation, which again tells me that the Jedi were not focused on physical threats, but focused on playing politics. Another sign that the galaxy is at peace. Grandmaster Rwoh would eventually form her own working group, loyal only to her and not the council, to pursue the suspects involved in this mystery. Now, this could be because the Brendok 4 were involved in some super shady stuff, we're not certain just yet, but this again further supports this idea that the Jedi were just not losing a lot of their operatives in the field. Furthermore, if you take a look at your typical High Republic Jedi deployment, it wasn't uncommon for them to send anywhere from 4 to a few dozen Jedi depending on the situation, unlike the prequel era when most Jedi deployments involved only a Jedi Master and their Padawan. High Republic deployments also seem to feature more Jedi Masters and Jedi Knights and very few Padawans. When Yar Fandar deploys on missions, he typically doesn't bring his Padawan Tassiloa, for instance, which indicates that Padawans, depending on their skill level during this time period, were gradually introduced to more dangerous situations, instead of being shoved into the crucible of live combat. The opposite could be said about the Clone Wars period, where the Jedi were sending teenagers onto the battlefield on a regular basis, and many of these kids ended up dying as a result. All of this should in theory lead to a much higher population of Jedi during the High Republic period. But as conflicts increased in number and became more intense in the years leading up to the prequel era, I imagine the Jedi Order's numbers would have drastically been reduced. Now, according to my research, during the prequel era, there were roughly around 10,000 Jedi active in the galaxy, and if you take a look at the demographics and break them down, it kind of makes sense. Most nations on Earth have roughly 15 to 25% of their population beneath the age of 15, so we're talking about maybe 2,000 out of the 10,000 Jedi are basically younglings and Padawans, and maybe another 1,000 or so are too old to take part in your usual field operations. Individuals like Tara Sinube and Grandmaster Oogway. They're both pretty competent, but again, you're not going to be sending them in the vanguard. This leaves about 7,000 Jedi, Knights, Masters, and Padawan who are capable of, doing field operations to some level. This seems to make sense because at the Battle of Petronaki Arena, the Jedi were able to only deploy about little over 200 Jedi on short notice, representing 2 to 3% of the Order's entire combat power. Most of them were probably located on Coruscant at the Jedi Temple or in a system near Geonosis. The loss of the majority of the strike team at Petronaki Arena, while devastating, wouldn't have destroyed the Order completely. This incident was also considered the largest deployment of Jedi since probably the Valo atrocity and the destruction of the Starlight Beacon during the High Republic era. But here's the weird thing. Further research helped me dig up an SFX interview of Star Wars producer Simon Emanuel. He worked on both Rogue One and the recent Acolyte series, and he states that there were still roughly around 10,000 Jedi in the High Republic period as well, which means that despite a much more peaceful galaxy, there was zero growth in the Jedi Order for centuries. Ultimately, this probably means what limits the Jedi Order's growth is just the natural pool of Force users available in the galaxy. With a population of over 100 quadrillion sentient beings living in the Star Wars galaxy, the likelihood of finding a Force-sensitive individual is ridiculously rare. If we take a look at the High Republic era, they clearly spent a lot of resources figuring out where these Force-sensitives were, and they also basically seized control of training all Force-sensitives in the galaxy. They had a monopoly over it, and they really did enforce this. The entire mission to Brendok, led by Master Andara, was undertaken because there was suspicion that a witch coven was illegally training underage Force users there. But despite having free reign over the entire galaxy and massive amounts of resources, the number of Force sensitives still remained relatively the same. This seems to indicate that the Cosmic Force, to a certain degree, likes to keep this number at the same rate because I guess it introduces some type of balance. This way you can't have Jedi procreating and making more Force users. And so this also makes sense that Emperor Palpatine was so desperate to find hidden holocrons with a list of Force-sensitive individuals in the galaxy. There seems to be a finite number of children in each generation, and so this kind of information would be priceless if you're trying to create an army of Force users. So there you have it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. My name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. See you next time.